In music of any length, there's a need to maintain interest. As we've already discussed, contrast is the key here. Creating suspense is all about keeping the listener involved. We see this all the time in film music or music for television, where right before a change of scene, something will happen to create curiosity, leaving the listener wanting to know what's going to happen next. In fiction, often the writer will end the chapter with something surprising or with a question to make the reader want to go on. This technique is especially common in mysteries or in dramatic fiction, but it's also often used in less obvious ways. Imagine, for example, a chapter where an important character has been alone for a while. Then there's a knock on the door. We want to know who it is, so we go on reading. In fact, one of the best compliments a writer of this kind of fiction can receive is that the reader just keeps going, couldn't stop. Musically, suspense is just as important. It has two components. First, a pattern of some kind that sets up clear expectations, and second, some kind of interruption or surprise that leaves our expectations not completely fulfilled. A simple, very common example would be a crescendo that suddenly ends with a subito piano. The listener feels that the gesture is somehow incomplete and expects to have it fulfilled, perhaps later on. There are many ways to create expectations with patterns like this. For example, increasingly dissonant harmony, gradual filling out or fitting of the texture, or a crescendo as mentioned above. These are simple examples of what I call progressions, not in the sense of harmonic progressions, but rather clear, incremental patterns that invite the listener to foresee a particular outcome. The interruption side of suspense can be achieved in numerous ways. A sudden unexpected contrast, a little pause at the peak of the progression, or even a little change in the pattern. To succeed, suspense needs a combination of pattern disruption and a follow-up that makes sense. For example, a timpani solo in the middle of a violin sonata would normally just sound out of place. In other words, the surprise must still follow logically from what precedes. Getting the right balance between novelty and continuity is critical. Here's an example. Here we have two ideas juxtaposed. The first one is a rising sequence, which just creates some expectation, namely that it will continue to rise further. The second idea is suddenly much louder in a different key or mode, in a different register and a different texture. Apart from the tempo and the fact that both are played on the piano, not much else connects these two ideas. In other words, the tension created by the sequence seems to have nothing to do with what follows. How could this be improved? Here's a first try. This is a bit better, since the sequence now goes downward, so at least the register of the second idea is prepared. But there's still a huge contrast. Well, let's add a crescendo to the descending sequence. This definitely improves things by moving toward the loud dynamic, but it could still be better. Here I start to modulate toward the flat keys during the sequence. This is much improved. The continuity is much more convincing. But let's say we want even more suspense. Here's one possibility. The slowing down in measure 4 with the eighth note suggests that some kind of change is coming. Then the silent bar here acts like an interruption, leaving the listener wondering for a moment what has happened. This creates more suspense. As we see here, the point is to get the degree of contrast and continuity just right, which often takes some experimentation. And this technique of managing transitions is a critical part of a composer's toolkit. We'll have more to say about transitions in a coming lesson. Suspense is a particular kind of transition, creating expectations but then leaving the listener in doubt about what will happen next.